All right, class. Chapter 5. um, Chapter 5 is very messy. There's no question that Chapter 5 is very messy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight into the questions, and if there's something within the questions that I need to refer back to the slides, I will. Question. Technology can have both a positive or a negative effect on a sales team. How can a sales manager ensure that they're using technology in a way that only brings positive attention to the salespeople? Well, the main thing is that, and came up in our CRM discussion, we are selling to tell people what's in it for them. If there's something in it for them, they'll be interested. Otherwise, they will not be. Sounds like logic. Sometimes firms use technology to get in the way of the message. The technology becomes a distraction. It becomes a crutch. It interferes. And then they have this new, there's this new program called Airshow. Do Google search on Airshow. And it's a way to do storytelling through iPad. And it's a really neat, really cool technology. It can help you tell a story. But you still have to tell a story. The technology is not going to sell something for you. You still have to sell. Maybe the technology can assist in that goal, but as soon as the technology is overtaking the goal, that's when it's a negative. Of all the forecasting methods, which is the most commonly used? All right, so here I'm going to pull up slides. Now, let me be perfectly clear. Sales forecasting is voodoo. I know I'm laughing, but it's true. We are forecasting the future. To the best of my knowledge, Harry Potter is fiction, and we do not have real crystal balls to be able to look into the future. If we did, we would not have to forecast. So, which is the most? It's really the subjective methods are the most common, because they're the least complicated. The objective methods, which require data, require statistics. And usually what some firms do is they use both, but then they sandbag the numbers a little bit to make sure it's better to be light on the forecast and overdo it than it is to have a huge forecast and to come under it. Because the sales forecast also, let's say we're forecasting 200,000 unit sales. Well, of that 200,000 unit sales, that requires X amount of advertising budget, X amount of salespeople, X amount of this. It's better to be light on the forecast at 200,000 than to say, well, if all things break the right way, it could be 350,000 units. And then you spend advertising dollars to support a 350,000 unit forecast. And guess what? You overdo it. You end up with like 270. Which if you forecast it at 200 or 225 and you hit 270, all your other costing, salespeople, advertising, admin, the whole thing, you're okay. But if you overshoot it and overspend and don't hit the number, then you have a bigger problem. But the subjective methods, particularly expectations and the composite, and also some expert opinions from outside, this is much more common. Okay, back to questions. 80-20 plural, it's extremely common. We keep talking about CRM, and sometimes if we have a big customer like a Walmart or a Target, guess what? It's even higher than 80-20. Very common, very true. And sometimes it's 90-10 or 95-5. It could be the case that you're in a company and 3 of your 10 customers are responsible for 80 to 90% of your entire revenue stream. Very common. There are several ways to analyze and forecast sales performance. In large organizations, the sales force may never be informed of what the forecast looks like. Well, it's not that what it looks like is how it's made. In a lot of sales organizations, the forecast is just presented as a fact. And they're just informed of the fact as opposed to how the forecast was made, or In your opinion, is it always necessary to share the information with the sales team, or is it appropriate to leave it to upper management? I think it's great to talk to the sales team. I think the minutia you can leave to upper management. I mean, if we're talking about a Delphi or we're talking about exponential smoothing, the sales force have other things to deal with. All you can tell them is, look, there's been a mixture of subjective and objective performance items here with regards to creating the forecast. And based on this, we think your number is 200,000 unit sales for this year, given the economic climate and given competition. You certainly have to walk through it with the sales team. Because I hate to say it, the sales forecast, it dominates the conversation during the year. It takes them 2 to 3 months to come up with it. And then they come up with it, and every 3 months they revise it. Because it really has to be accurate. They revise it up or down. Because depending on how your numbers are doing vis-a-vis forecast is how much more you can expend vis-a-vis because the sales team is the revenue stream for the firm. It's very important. It's very complicated. Increasing the number of salespeople will increase volume. True. But also increase costs. Very, very, very true. How do you balance this? Well, there are a number of different ways to balance this, and we see this in the back end of the chapter, where, it may not be, you could have 3 salespeople maximize sales, but each one of them is working at 60% of their capacity. Is it better to have 3 salespeople or 2 salespeople with only a 10% drop in revenue and them working at 95% capacity? Well, each salesperson has X amount of costs. I mean, think about whatever their sales number is. Think about adding 30% of that number in commission and another 30% in healthcare and travel expenses and all these other ancillaries. So guess what? You really do have to be careful with adding salespeople because it is a dramatic. And the other thing is it's very painful to just immediately fire a salesperson. You really get to have the sustained volume to have a salesperson on. Another reason why a lot of people use outside salespeople, because you only have to pay them for what they actually sell. How do you compensate for a wrong forecast? You adjust. I mean, just like I said earlier, the sales forecast gets tweaked every 3 months. It really does. It takes them about 3 months to build it, and every quarter it gets changed, up or down. Which forecasting method do you choose when you tried all different methods and the forecasts do not match up at all? Well, every forecast is going to come up with a different number. And usually what happens is they do a smoothing where they use 3 or 4 different forecasts to come up with the number. The subjective forecast alone, Delphi alone, none of these alone come up with it. It's sort of like watching the weather. And you see the weather guys, we got a storm, and here's the European model, and here's the American model. And you see the hurricane, and there's like 5 different lines. And you put the line in between that, which is the most likely path. That's some of the smoothing. How does a manager deal with a salesperson who thinks his or her quota is set too high? Well, it could be the case that his or her quota is set too high. It is actually too high. And a lot of sales managers is extremely competent, especially in top-down Theory X type organizations, to have a number that no one can reach. I think it's highly demotivating to do that. But the quota really should be a dialogue between the manager and the salesperson. It shouldn't be something that the manager decides in isolation. What should companies do when sales forecasts have not been met? Well, if didn't we just ask that? Forecasts that have not been met is a much bigger problem than exceeding a forecast. And that's why I don't like to use the word sandbag too much, but maybe the better word is conservative. The best forecasts, in my opinion, are conservative forecasts. because there's a tremendous cost financial on the balance sheet that if you expensed up to a certain number and you don't hit the number, then there's a big problem. Question: how does a sales manager react by the iceberg situation? I thought people from departments may have different thoughts on it. For example, finance manager only wants to see the final number, and then we lose it. The iceberg situation mainly is, in most icebergs, you only see a third of it above the water. Two-thirds of it or more are below the water. So each department only sees so much of a particular problem. So to me, this gets back to market orientation. You have to have conversation across departments. Otherwise, you're not going to come to the most optimal scenario. The finance manager only wants to see what the finance manager wants to see. The sales manager only wants to see what the sales manager wants to see. The operations manager only cares about operations. Yet the three of these individuals need to get together on an ongoing basis to make sure that they can optimize what's best for the firm, for the customer, not for their department. Questions. In your experience, are the different forecasts better to use for specific industries? No. Not in particularly. It's based on the personnel within the firm that decides which forecast is used. There are a lot of firms that outsource the forecast because they don't have the time, the energy, or the knowledge to create a real forecast. I've seen those. Or can they basically apply to the industry? These are very open type templates that you can use across industries. Think of it more of is Excel only good for a particular industry? No. Can you give examples? There's too many examples. In my experience in Bank of America, the sales officers use Subjective and a Salesforce composite. Just wondering if one method is more prevalent than others in any. No, these are not specific to one industry or another. Chances are there is an organizational history why it's always subjective, or they don't have the people there to do the objective methods, or there's some politics involved with doing objective. Okay, we're good here. If you were to start a sales force from scratch for a small company with less than $1 million in sales, how would you personally go about setting the quota for each salesperson? If there's only $1 million in sales, and chances are you probably only have 2 or 3 salespeople, we care less about quotas at this point. Just let them go sell. It's a small firm, Let them go sell, and as opposed to a quota, I don't know how much forecasting. See, the quota helps with the forecast. You start with a forecast, and then you start breaking the forecast down by quarters and months and weeks. And then what happens is you end up with, to make sure that you're on pace for this particular forecast, you have quotas for each week, month, quarter, semi-annual, and annual. They're mile markers. They're guideposts. It's like us driving up and down the New Jersey Turnpike, or the Parkway. We want to know where we're at, where there's all those mile markers there. That's kind of what a quota is. In your opinion, what are the top pitfalls to avoid when setting up a sales territory model? One is that the territory is so rigid that changes can't be made. 2, that the territories aren't rich enough, meaning there's not enough revenue in a particular territory to keep a salesperson happy. 3, that the territories do not have overlap, because if you have a territory and you're organized by geography, you don't want a salesperson going out of their geography and poaching customers from someone else's geography. I think they're probably the top 3 that come off the top of my head. Let me undo that and change. Most quotas are volume-based, with certain emphasis program initiatives about marketing. Perhaps. When I was in sales, I would always sandbag the end of the year, delaying orders sometime starting in October. As a marketer, I see the overall trends of sandbagging, which causes some irregular seasons. Hold on, division. What are some of the win-win techniques to remove this seasonality? Well, sandbag, or another way to read this is like, perhaps you put orders in, you already hit quota for a particular quarter, and you want these orders to go into the next quarter. Or you want these orders to be backdated to go into a particular quarter because you've already hit there and you get into bonus territory. Salespeople always want to do something like that. It's extremely common. Could it cause some irregularities in the firm? Yes. This is an example here. Should the operations manager, the finance manager, and the sales manager have a conversation to make sure that we can figure a way out of these irregularities, especially if they're detrimental to the overall firm? Yeah. I mean, I get quotas, but some firms overdo the quotas and they slam it over people's heads, and they just make everybody's lives miserable. Make it a win-win for them that also removes the seasonality. Don't have so much of their sales, their overall revenue for the year, their salary based on these quotas and hitting quotas. Can implementing unattainable quotas benefit a business profitability or revenue? No, I'm not a fan of implementing unattainable quotas. They demotivate your sales force. And when you have a firm and your salespeople are responsible for 100% of your revenue, the last thing you want is unmotivated salespeople. Is the head of the IT department considered just as powerful within a company as a CFO or CMO? Well, a CTO would be, because this is the C-suite. CMO, CFO, COO, CEO, CTO, Chief Technical Officer. But the head of an IT department, director of IT, is not the same level of a C-suite executive. Not the same pay scale. Is the IT or technology used within a company more important than the actual ability of salespeople? No. This goes back to some of our Chapter 4 question. IT and technology supports the selling, but it can't replace the salespeople. In almost every case, particularly with complex selling in B2B, no. In today's world, not utilizing state-of-the-art technology will leave you behind. Perhaps, not always. I'm not necessarily in agreement with that. I know this question may seem somewhat naive, but does technological ability influence the hiring of some salespeople? It depends. Good firms train. And if they don't have the technological ability from the get-go, but they know how to sell. I mean, look at the pharmaceutical people. Okay, look at the pharmaceutical firms. Doctors know the medicine and they know the bio and they know the chemistry. But most pharmaceutical salespeople come out of management, marketing, business schools. They don't have science classes. So guess what? They get trained. They have to take exams and tests, and they have to be licensed to sell certain drugs. They get the technical training in medicine that they need for a particular drug. Will companies use different types of forecasting methods for different types of sales groups or teams? Usually what happens is that the company has a limitation for what they know how to do or not know how to do. So usually the company stays relatively consistent because they want the same kind of forecasting from across groups or teams or divisions. So you can more easily compare apples to apples, orange to oranges. I mean, having a subjective one here and Having 4 different objective ones for 4 different sales teams, I don't know about that. How does a company determine what method of sales quota forecasting to use for different salespeople? Is it trial or error? No. Or is the salesperson going to conform to the ways of the company? The salesperson has input on the forecast. They have input on the quota, but the sales manager really sets it. The sales manager and the senior VP of sales are in charge of creating the forecast. They get input from the salesperson. Hopefully there's a good dialogue, but 70-30, 60-40, 66-33, yeah, that's about right. Do you think information systems will force most stores to move towards mobile POS systems? No. Mobile POS systems are very helpful in very good situations. We're mostly talking about B2C, because in B2B scenarios, rarely does the person signing the scenario also can pay. That's a different department. They got to put a purchase order in. So just having a POS system as a salesperson, that's fine for the Apple Store. That's fine for restaurants. That's fine where the end user is also the end buyer. But that's not the case with most B2B scenarios. It's very cool technology. I just don't know how much it's going to be used in B2B. Okay, very cool. Chapter 5 it is. And thank you. I'm going to put this one up.